fellow knitters, welcome to my video on knitting charts. In this video I'll be showing you how to actually read as well as work from a knitting chart. Knitting charts are created to basically condense knitting instructions or knitting directions. And to kind of summarize that real quick, the project that I'm going to be demonstrating this on actually has 72 stitches on the needle, and you're actually to in this particular pattern, you're to knit 31 rows. So if you look at the knitting chart here, the knitting chart actually is only 76 stitches. I'm sorry, it represents 72 stitches, but it's actually, and if you actually count them out, this is not the number of stitches at first glance on your knitting needle. And the same thing is the rows that go up here stop at 15, but like I said, there's 31 rows that we're actually going to be knitting. What a knitting chart allows you to do is to incorporate repeated patterns within it without having to either diagram them in a knitting chart or without having to write them out, which would take up several pages in order to do so. So the first thing you want to do is when you look at your chart, now your chart has all these symbols in it, and if you ever took world geography and you worked with maps, maps always had a legend to kind of tell you what the symbols stood for. So there's a concept here that's similar, and that's the stitch key. So the stitch key translates what these little symbols mean, in essence, how you are to knit the stitch. The other thing too is the symbols that are used, once you actually have your work and you've done this pattern, if you lay your work next to the pattern kind of somewhat resembles what you actually have in your knitting work. Alright, so on the right side of your knitting chart, you've got these odd numbers here, and then on the left side you've got even numbers. And basically that's just to split up the rows. The bottom row is always row 1, which of course we should be familiar with, but instead of putting a 2 in between the 1 and the 3, the 2 is just put on the left side. Now when you work a knitting chart, you always work in a serpentine motion. And you always begin a knitting chart in the lower right corner. And then you work from right to left. And then after you get to this point, you go directly above, and then you work the chart left to right. And then when you get here, you move directly above and then work it again right to left. So it's like a serpentine motion. Now, of course, you're knitting, when you're actually knitting, you're always working from right to left off of your left needle. And of course, you turn your work. And you turn your work when you're at the end of a row. Now, the patterns that you have here, so another way to try to condense the chart, because that's the object of having a knitting chart, is condensing as much as possible, and you do that by having these stitches or these boxes represent 2 actions versus just 1. So that gives you one less symbol to have to work with. If you can have a symbol that does one thing on the right side and then does another thing on the wrong side. The other thing too is the way that you condense a knitting chart is by having repeated sections. And so there's actually 2 repeat sections represented in this chart here. There's this red bracket right here, or this red box. And what that means is everything in here, as far as these columns or these stitches, you repeat when you're in here so many times. And of course, the instructions tell you how many times to repeat when you're within this red zone, or this red bracketed zone. And then the second repeat section is this blue bracket up here. And what this tells you to do is to repeat these rows, these 8 rows here, a certain number of times, again based on whatever's written in the instructions. Specifically for this pattern, once you get into this zone, you're actually to repeat this pattern 4 times. So what that means is you start off with your first stitch, and then your second stitch, third stitch, and then your fourth stitch. And then once you get to your 5th stitch, you've crossed into this zone. And this is your repeat zone. And so the instructions say to actually repeat this zone 4 times. So you go through and you knit all these stitches, which is, there's 15 of them. When you get here, you don't continue on, because you actually have to go back to the beginning of the section, or this bracketed section, and then do it a second time. And then once you get here, you go back here, do it a third time, and then once you've done it a fourth time, now you can leave this zone and continue on in here. So as you can see, that really condenses the work. Now, going upwards when you're doing your rows, when you reach row 7 and then you go to row 8, which is the row directly above this blue line, you've entered this blue bracketed zone. And so you just continue on as normal, but when you get to the top, you don't stop because the instructions say to repeat twice more. So then you come down to the beginning, which is again row 8, and then knit these 8 rows. And then the second time is to come back down here to row 8, and then knit upwards to row 15. And then that finishes. So again, that's 31 stitches, which, I mean, if you were to literally put all, 31 rows. If you were to put all 31 rows or represent all 31 rows on this chart, it would be up to here. So utilizing, and that's very common in knitting, is to have a repeat zone, or you repeat rows or repeat stitches, and that's how you create a pattern. And that can be represented very well in a knitting chart. As a side note, there's actually software out there that you can use to make your own knitting charts if you create your own patterns, or to translate written instructions. If you happen to find some written instructions that maybe should have had a knitting chart, you could actually translate those into a nice knitting chart. Now, let's talk about the stitch key. So the stitch key tells you what each of these stitches is you're supposed to do. So anything that has, it's basically an open box. When you are on the right side of your knitting, which is rows 1, 3, 5, 6, it's your odd number rows, those boxes tell you that you knit. Now, when you've turned your work and you're doing your even rows, which are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc., these boxes, they switch roles. So instead of it being knit, you're actually purling. But again, that's on the wrong side. And then these little boxes here with the minuses in them, same concept. So when you're on the right side of your work, which are the odd rows, you are to purl on the right side. And then when you are on your even number rows, which would be the wrong side of the work, you're actually to knit any box that has a minus symbol in it. And then the other thing too is I will be demonstrating all these stitches in working from the knitting chart for you. Now, what's interesting is there is a symbol in here that is not actually cast onto your needle. So I've cast on 72 stitches, but if you were to count out these actual stitches, you'd arrive at 76, because you've got 4 here, and then you've got 12 here, so that's 16, and then 15, which is in this red section here. Well, 15 times 4 is 60, 60 plus 16 is 76. Well, that's 4 more stitches than what I've actually cast onto my needle. So what's going on there, you might ask? What's going on is you're introducing this, there's a symbol here with a circle in it, and that's a yarn over. And a yarn over is where you are introducing a stitch onto your needle that wasn't there before. You're actually putting on an additional stitch. And so you figure, well, if there's one here and I'm repeating this 4 times, that's 4 extra stitches that I'm introducing onto my needle. Well, 72 plus 4 is indeed 76. So that's why these numbers here, the number of stitches here, don't correspond to what's on your needle. So don't let that freak you out. Because here's the other thing, and I sometimes refer to these as phantom stitches, because you put them on, and then when you turn your work and knit in the opposite direction, or go back down your needle, you immediately take them off, because here's a symbol here. It looks like an upside down Y that leans to the right, and that is purl 2 together. And that's for every even row that you're on, which is the wrong side. You're purling 2 together, and what you're purling together is the normal stitch that you had originally cast onto the needle, in addition to that yarn over. So you're kind of netting those 4 stitches back to 0, which means your work still has only 72 stitches on it. And then there's a symbol here that's an upside down Y that leans to the left, or slants to the left, and that is a slip knit slip knit pass, and that's where you slip the stitch. You slip the first stitch, you knit the second stitch, and then you pass the first stitch over the second stitch that you just knitted, and I'll demonstrate that as well. And then finally, the final symbol, and I'm going to, I won't knit all 31 rows for you, but I'll knit up to row 5 to demonstrate all of these stitches that are represented in the stitch key. This symbol right here, which spans across 4 stitches, is it's a 4-stitch left cable. So for this, you will need a cabling needle. I've kind of been holding on to it. You will also need stitch markers, which I've got some right here. Don't buy stitch markers, guys. It's a waste of money, number one. But number two, some of the stitch markers out there, especially the plastic ones, in a project like this, they can hurt you. They can actually, when you're gripping your needles to knit, there's a sharp end that can actually stick into your fingers. And I never understood why they make stitch markers like that. But these are just little things I found around my house that make perfect stitch markers. This is an old zipper head. These are some old little tiny keys on a little tiny ring that was for a little locket. And then these are just old parts from keychains. So, look for that. Earrings, I have a friend who uses earrings. Those work perfectly as well. But we use these to basically mark the zone, our repeat zone, basically. And that is basically how you read a knitting chart. So in the second section, what I'm going to do is go through and actually demonstrate each of these stitches for you.